Welcome, guys, to CC Ngu podcast. Engineer CC, we're excited to have you here in the studio. We're still discussing the book titled The Pulpits That Blinded Africa. This book discussed how weaponized religion stole Africa's mind, progress, and promise. And in today's episode, we'll be discussing Chapter 1, The Day the Gates Closed. Engineer CC, this topic alone feels heavy. Please, what gates are we talking about here?
The gates of thinking, the gates of inquiry, the gates of responsibility. They didn't slam shut overnight. They closed slowly, sermon by sermon.
You argue that collapse doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it starts quietly, inside doctrine.
That's a compelling point. In many African communities in the late 20th century, something paradoxical happened. As religious passion increased, intellectual curiosity decreased.
That's a bold statement. What do you think caused it?
A few key factors. The louder the prayers became, the quieter reason became.
That's so true. It's like the volume of faith drowns out logic. Let's talk about hospitals. You mentioned documented trends in places like Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, Uganda, Zimbabwe, where families withdrew patients from hospitals for crusades.
Yes. In the 80s and 90s, sermons like "Hospitals treat, but only God heals" became popular. Medicine was labeled the arm of flesh. Chemotherapy was called demonic in some pulpits.
And people believed that?
Deeply, hospitals became symbols of weak faith. Crusade grounds became symbols of spiritual strength. The result, treatable illnesses turned fatal.
So this wasn't rejection of God, it was rejection of science in God's name.
Exactly. When doctrine replaces medical responsibility, people die, not because God failed, but because thinking was discouraged.
You also talk about what you call heaven-mindedness becoming earth-blindness.
Yes. Verses like Matthew 6:19, "Lay not up treasures on earth," were interpreted as don't invest, don't build, don't plan.
But that verse addresses greed, not development.
Correct, but nuance was lost. Planning was labeled faithlessness. Long-term thinking was considered worldly. Nation building seemed irrelevant because Jesus is coming soon.
So infrastructure became an afterthought?
Why build roads for a world that will burn? Why fund research if the rapture is near? That mindset seeped into politics, education, economics, everything.
One of the most provocative parts of this chapter is where you say the politicians sat under the same sermons.
Yes, leaders are not born in a vacuum. Many African presidents and ministers grew up in these churches. They absorbed the same worldview.
So when they prioritized prayer over policy, they were being consistent with what they were taught?
Exactly. If a pulpit says, "Do not invest in this world," and a minister believes it, why would he aggressively fund infrastructure?
Exactly. The actions don't match the words. You know, there are cases where leaders sought prophetic direction before economic meetings to align policy with higher wisdom.
Because heaven was seen as superior to earthly systems.
So planning seemed less important.
Exactly. Prayer looked sufficient.
I see. You trace some of this thinking back to the missionary era.
Yes. Colonial missionaries often emphasize obedience, humility, and heaven.
Interesting. Can you expand on that?
Imagine a population focused on eternity is less likely to question earthly domination.
That's a profound point. So after independence, the colonizers left, but the theology remained?
Exactly. It was a more subtle form of control. The chains were no longer political. They were psychological.
That's a profound shift. It explains a lot. Let's talk about the mind becoming a battlefield.
Many sermons mocked intellect as worldly wisdom. Universities were treated with suspicion. Scientists were labeled arrogant.
So education became almost sin adjacent?
In some regions, yes. Students were warned that too much education kills faith. This tension between knowledge and belief is a recurring theme. Fields like psychology, biology, political science were portrayed as threats.
Exactly. Those fields challenge the status quo. And when a society distrusts intellect?
Innovation dies, research stalls, policy weakens, the future narrows.
In the subtitle, you call it weaponized religion. Don't you think that's intense?
It's meant to be. The truth often is. Because it followed patterns, repeated phrases, emotional triggers, fear-based rhetoric.
I see. Do you mean fear of questioning?
Yes, do not question your pastor. Once that principle, do not question your pastor, is accepted, the entire worldview becomes untouchable.
That's a powerful point.
And without questioning,
there's no correction.
Exactly.
No correction means no progress. You describe the 70s and 80s as a turning point, important revival waves promising both prosperity and escape.
Yes, people were traumatized by war, poverty, dictatorship. They were spiritually thirsty. And when someone says, "Don't struggle, God will do it for you," that message spreads fast.
But such message was detrimental because it created dependency?
Yes, exactly. It created a reliance that was hard to break. People prayed instead of preparing, waited instead of working, and leaders did the same.
There's a haunting image at the end of this chapter, a president in church nodding as a pastor says, that it was prayer, not planning, that determines a nation's future.
And you know what? A week later, that same president cuts the health budget by faith,
Both convinced they were honoring God.
and both unintentionally crippling a nation.
So when you say the day the gates closed, you're not talking about a single event.
Exactly. It's more about a gradual shift in mindset. I'm talking about an era when belief distorted became a barrier, when faith misdirected paralyzed progress.
And the continent stood between two worlds?
A heaven promised and an earth abandoned.
I see. All right, we'll stop here, guys. Thank you, Engineer CC, for coming around. Please DM him if you desire private counseling. Also, remember this book is available on Amazon. See you guys in the next episode. My name is Amanda. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda.